Hello friends, today's topic of discussion is alternative Hindi cinema, and we'll talk about the films which have been made in the framework of the alternative cinema. And it has also been argued that the alternative cinema was some kind of an alternative to the mainstream films, which were considered to be largely masala films of the earlier times, and thereafter how we see that whether it is called as art cinema or the parallel cinema, and how it was able to create some kind of an impact on the society as well, and how it also borrowed from the themes of the society, the everyday themes which were there in the society, the socio-economic, political, cultural problems which were there in the society. They were being taken up in the alternative Hindi cinema. And the filmmakers, those who were associated with the alternative Hindi cinema, the origins can be seen from 1940s in itself, when we have filmmakers like Bimal Roy, V. Shantaram, etc. Some of their films, they were trying to talk about those kinds of issues which were later seen in the alternative Hindi cinema of 1960s, 70s and 80s. And we find that all these filmmakers, they were concerned with the kind of issues which were existent in the society, and they wanted to make some kind of a comment on these kinds of issues, and they came up with a number of aspects which were related with these issues and tried to give it some kind of a treatment to these films. And many a times these films, they were also being rejected by the masses because the kind of themes and the kind of treatment which was being given to these films was not concerned with the popular taste of the people. But the kind of issues which they raised, they were very relevant. They were relevant not only at that point of time, but they are relevant even now, because they talk about the issues of the kind of distinctions which are there in the society between people. They were talking about poverty, they were talking about inequality. They were also talking about the kind of rights and the privileges which are not given to everyone, who is there in the society. So the concerns of the masses, they were also being reflected in this kind of a cinema. When we talk about the kind of references, one can talk about Aruna Vasudev's New Indian Cinema, Satyajit Ray's Our Films, Their Films, Gulzar et al., Encyclopedia of Hindi Cinema, and then Wikipedia.com. Some of the references to the films could be easily found on Wikipedia, and thereafter one can refer to the various articles and books which have been written on these films. And nowadays we have also seen that a lot of research is also being conducted in many of the academic institutions on cinema. So MPhils and PhDs, they have also been done on cinema in the academic institutions and various universities. So that kind of unpublished material will also serve as some sort of a source in terms of understanding the alternative Hindi cinema. When we talk about the various kinds of ideas which are related to this kind of a work, which is largely seen to be experimental in nature, which is considered to be some kind of a more serious work, which is not designed for the mass appeal. So in that context, when we say that it has been referred to the art cinema or the cinema which is catering to a particular kind of an audience, and when one is talking about the kind of features, one see that how the socio-political climate of the times is being reflected in this particular cinema. And we also see that the realism and naturalism, they are also being depicted in the films which are dealing with the alternative Hindi cinema. They also reject the dance and the song numbers which are there, and they are typical of the mainstream commercial cinema. So we find that how the dance and the song numbers, which are generally part of the mainstream commercial cinema, where we find that not many films are made which are devoid of dance and song. So they, in a way, such kind of alternative cinema rejects the kind of dance and song numbers, and the kind of content which is there in these films, that they are trying to portray the reality in some manner. The content is also very serious in nature. And we see that if some of the films of earlier times, if we can see then Udair Pathe or Hamrahi, which was made in 1945 by Bimal Roy, thereafter Dharti Ke Lal in 1946 by K. Abbas, Nichanagar in 1946 by Chetan Anand, and Chinnamool in 1948, which was again one of the important films of that time, which was made and which was being discussed. And when you talk about this kind of a cinema, then we find that these films, they were also catering to the masses as well, and but at the same time these films, they had some kind of message for the society as well, because Udair Pathe, which was later made in as Hamrahi, which was earlier in Bengali as Udair Pathe, and both these films, they were very, very successful. These were the first films which were made by Bimal Roy, and as they were being made before the independence of India, then we see that how the protagonist of the film is a person who is shown to be a nationalist, and how his ideas, they were able to influence the entire generation as well. So seen from that perspective, we find that a film called Dharti Ke Lal was by K. Abbas, which was dealing with the Bengal famine of 1943. And this film basically was released when the partition riots had broken out in certain areas, and because of which we find that during this particular period, especially when the Direct Action Day was in a way initiated by the Muslim League, and how these kinds of riots which came about because of the kind of a situation which came about because of the political decisions taken by the Muslim League at that point of time, this film could not become all that successful from the commercial point of view. But it was a real gem in that sense that it was trying to convey the kind of hardships which people had to suffer because of the political decisions which were taken by the colonial government in terms of sending a lot of supplies from India to other countries during the times of war, thereby creating some kind of artificial scarcities in the market, because of which we see that thousands and lakhs of people, millions of people, they died in the Bengal famine. Thereafter, we also see another film called Nicha Nagar by Chetan Anand, which was talking about the issues of the upper town and the lower town. The Nicha Nagar and the upper and the Uncha Nagar, they were the places where the rulers and the ruled, they lived. And we find that in the Nicha Nagar, the people, those who were being ruled, they were living, and their situation in the sense that how the people, those who were in power, similarly we find that such kind of picturizations were also trying to convey the kind of social problems which were there in the society, that the person who was living in the Uncha Nagar was referred to as Sarkar, also reflective of the government as well. So we find Chanamul, again a film which was made in 1948, and this film was talking about the kind of displacement which had happened because of partition. And it was a Bengali film, and we find that some of the actors in these films were the real refugees, those who had migrated from Pakistan and Bangladesh, and because of which we find that this kind of a situation was in a way realistic portrayal for them, because they were the ones, those who had recently been replaced. So this film largely was also trying to convey some kind of concerns which were related to the partition, and they were far more realistic in the sense that we find that the filmmakers, they were also shooting by some kind of a mobile camera, going out of the streets, and then they were shooting these kinds of films. Then we also talk about the various kinds of influences from abroad as well, and neorealism was one from the Italian cinema which was able to influence these films, and we find that how the French New Wave, which came in 1950s, and in the context of the French cinema, and how in the Indian context we find it to be the Indian New Wave of the 1960s and 70s, where we find that so many films, they were being made which were dealing with these kinds of problems which were existent in the society. And we find that the kind of regional variation, because at that in 1940s we find that the studio system began to crumble. Before that, studios, they were far more dominant, and how they were contributing in terms of making films, and by mid 1940s we find that there is a rise of the star system. And when you talk about the kind of influence from Italy, we see that film movement in Italy is referred to as neorealism, and how it was against the white telephone films. and it was also trying to reject the fascist propaganda which was there in the society. And this cinema was meaningful and purposeful cinema as well. So in that sense, when we try to understand neorealism, we find that how the white telephone becomes the hallmark of this particular cinema, where we find that these films which were extravagant in nature, which were more popular in nature, and how the white telephones which was being shown in the film, which was very expensive in nature, and these films, they were largely concerned with some kind of escapism during the times of the fascist government. And whatever propaganda the fascists, they were in a way leading, it was being rejected by the neorealist cinema, which was dealing with the socio-economic cultural problems of those times. And they were also trying to communicate some kind of a meaning or purpose to the films. And when we also see that how the various film directors of those times which were concerned with the neorealist cinema, how they were able to create some kind of a mark within the Italian society through their films. And Roberto Rossellini in film Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, which was made in 1945, Vittorio Di Sica in Ladri di Bicicletta, Bicycle Thieves, which was made in 1948, and Visconti in La Terra Trema, Earth Trembles in 1948. So these were some of the films which were referred to as the neorealist cinema. And these filmmakers, those who were associated with neorealist films, they were being in a way seen to be some sort of a harbinger of new kind of wave which came in the Italian films. And they had their own sets, in that sense that they had their own ideas, and with those ideas they wanted to portray reality in a particular kind of a manner. So they did not just sit and talk about creating some kind of a neorealism, rather they went with their own kind of an aesthetic which was there with them, and with that kind of an aesthetic they wanted to make that kind of a cinema. And when we talk about the Indian filmmakers, then we see that how some of the filmmakers like Satyajit Ray, Ritvik Ghatak, Manal Sen, they were acclaimed from the international point of view as well. And thereafter we have Mani Kaul, Kumar Sahni, Shyam Benegal, etc. And these later filmmakers, those who were there in the 1970s and 80s as well, and these filmmakers, they had their own kind of a signature style with which they were trying to make their own particular kind of a cinema. And many times we find that these alternative films, they were not all that successful from the commercial point of view. And but at the same time, when you talk about the various kinds of features or characteristics or the portrayals and the treatment, rather the setup in that sense of mise-en-scene, then we realize that these films were far more important, keeping in mind the kind of problems which were being seen or experienced by the masses. And when we talk about the various filmmakers, some of the important filmmakers, one of them was Satyajit Ray, and how his career in advertising is one of the important concerns, and how that kind of a career in advertising provided him also an opportunity to closely make some kind of caricatures of what he actually wanted in the films as well. And we find that Satyajit Ray in a way made caricatures or some kind of drawings of the scenes which he visualized for his films. Then we also find some kind of influence of the Italian neorealism on Satyajit Ray, and he also had some kind of influence of Jean Renoir. And we find that he did not have much money to produce Pather Panchali, which is considered to be one of the important classics of India, and the way he got finance from the government of Bengal, which supported the making of Pather Panchali. And when Pather Panchali was in a way acclaimed at the international level, and it also became popular in later times, we find so Satyajit Ray basically made 3 films of Pather Panchali, Aparajito and Aput Sansar as Aput trilogy, because the kind of continuation of the story takes place in all these films, and all of them, they are being treated in such a manner, or they are being presented by Satyajit Ray in such a manner that they are able to convey the reality of those times. And when you talk about one of the most important films of Satyajit Ray, and from the point of view rather the alternative cinema, then we find that Pather Panchali, which was a song of the Little Road, which was made in 1955, talks about the village life in India, and we find that the film has some kind of a lyrical quality, and the critics, they have argued that it was a film showing the decline of a certain class, and the way Satyajit Ray tried to give that kind of a treatment, and Ray was also criticized for showing the poverty of India. And we find that how India being a poor country after the kind of the rule of the British for 200 years, and because of which we find that the kind of portrayal of poverty which takes place in this particular film, and because of which even Ray was criticized that he was trying to cash on the poverty of India. And we also find that how so many people, those who visit India in earlier times, you have seen that they are also trying to capture the kind of poverty which is existent in India, though it may also seem that such kind of similar situation may also exist in some of the other countries as well, but they are more concerned with showing the kind of poverty of the East in that manner. Then we also find that the way Satyajit Ray made so many films, and the way he was being recognized at international level or national level, where we find that he was awarded the Dada Saheb Phalke Award. He was also honored by France by the Legion of Honor in 1987, and thereafter he also received the highest civilian honor, Bharat Ratna, as well. And we also find that he was also given the Oscars, for the honorary Oscars in 1992 for the Lifetime Achievement. And thereafter he also received the Akira Kurosawa Award for the Lifetime Achievement, and that was given to him posthumously. Then apart from Satyajit Ray, we also see that filmmakers like Ritwik Ghatak, who was a member of Indian People's Theatre Association, and in his cinema we find the pain of partition, that how it got reflected in the films which were made by him. And when you talk about the trilogy which was made by him, the Megha-Katara, Komal Gandhar and Subhan Rekha, then we find that all these films, they have some kind of a common theme. And when you talk about these kinds of themes, then we find that how the displacement of the thousands of the masses from their homelands, where they were being called refugees in their own homeland, that was one of the concerns which was shown in the films which were made by Ritwik Ghatak. And it was also showing the economic decline of Bengal as well, that how Bengal was declining as some kind of an economic power, because how the British, they had taken away the kind of resources from India, and the partition which also unleashed the kind of violence in India. And because of the partition, because of the division into the parts of India and Pakistan, was also in a way economically detrimental to the Indian interests. Then we also talk about the various films of Ghatak, where we find that Ghatak is talking in the framework of some kind of a contemptuous denunciation of the crumbling humanity and the vanishing human values in all the films which are made by him in the framework of the films which are dealing with the ideas of partition. And when you talk about the events of partition, they are seen to be insane events of partition. Some kind of a criticism was also talked about by Kamini Kaushal. And we find that if one is talking about the Ghatak cinema, then the common themes of the displacement of the thousands of the masses from their homelands was one of them, and how these people, they were surviving in the refugee colonies, was another. Then we find that how the Bengal, when it declined because of the partition of India, and many times partition is also being seen as some sort of a process or as a continuing experience, keeping in mind many times we find that how people, they get separated from each other, or they have some kind of differences with each other. So we have to see that how partition as an experience has some kind of a relevance for so many people, those who got displaced, those who tried to see partition as some kind of a personal loss, not only in terms of the loss of their relatives, etc., but also we see that their displacement led to their economic decline or economic deficiency, where whatever they had in the place in which they were living earlier, that they had to leave everything behind and start their life from the scratch when they shifted to new surroundings. So we see that this kind of a struggle was there for the people, those who migrated, those who were even referred to as refugees within their own country. And we also see that how Bengal also declined during this particular period. Thereafter, we also see that these kinds of filmmakers, as I told you about Satyajit Ray, or for that matter Ritvik Ghatak, all of them, they were trying to convey some kind of a reality of those times. And these films, they were seen to be precursors to the kind of cinema which was made in the later times by filmmakers like Kumar Sahni, Mani Kaul, all of them, those who started this kind of a movement in 1960s and thereafter. And how Mrinal Sen, for example, began with Bhuvan Shom in 1969. So all this we'll discuss in our next lecture. Thank you very much.